So on Classic Screen this episode, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, directed by John Ford, starring James Stewart, John Wayne, Lee Marvin and Vera Mills. Now, despite me being a massive Western fan, I'm not overly familiar with John Ford's work at all. I'm far from an expert on Ford or classic Westerns in general. I'm no expert, as you know, Eamon. In fact, one of the reasons I like to do these classic screens is to fill in the large gaps on my film catalogue. I am, however, very familiar with Jimmy Stewart as a Western icon, especially in a string of collaborations with the director Anthony Mann, The Man from Laramie, Bend of the River, movies like that. And what is very striking about Stewart and his Western roles is just the sheer variety of roles he manages to inhibit within the genre, despite the very specific, homely persona that I think has been vital to his charm and his success. I always think of him as the original Tom Hanks, actually. He is the ultimate everyman and very likeable, but I think the roles so far I've seen him in are a much more wider variety than that of Tom Hanks. So in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, it follows the story of a senator played by Jimmy Stewart who became famous for killing this notorious outlaw, and the film opens with his return for the funeral of an old friend played by John Wayne, and he recounts the story. Now, to begin with, I thought this kind of contrived setup, eventually leading to the real story, eventually being told through flashbacks, was unnecessary and arbitrary. However, as the movie went on, I realised that there was a quite genius to the opening moments that only really hit home near the conclusion of the story, that maybe didn't seem as relevant to begin with. So rather than being arbitrary, this whole flashback device allowed us to see the long-term effects of a discrepancy, shall we say, without giving too much away, that might have only acted as a devastating conclusion to a final scene, and the mechanics of which might have worked very similar to that of a twist. But by allowing us to see the longevity of the actions taken by mainly John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart's character, it becomes something more poignant by the movie carrying on after the event, even though this mostly takes place at the beginning of the film with a much older James Stewart returning to Shinbone for the funeral, and also the film's final scene on a train where the legacy of this discrepancy again is shown. Now, if you've seen the movie, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't, hopefully this sounds at least less like waffle and more like ramblings that will pique your curiosity to make you want to watch the film to know what the fuck I'm actually talking about. Now, there is a few questions that I want to present when it comes to The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And something I noticed is the case in a lot of classic movies I've seen so far. I'm talking about movies like the Defiant ones, and that is the line between themes, ideology, and if these are in service of the story and characters, or the other way around. Now, I much prefer when something like social justice is in the service of a story and the character, rather than feeling like something exists entirely to get a message to the people. Even if it's not, I do give social justice much more of a pass when it comes to older movies, especially when it comes to something like race, because I consider it much more relevant in 1962 than now. So there is a great line in this movie at one point where a black actor played brilliantly by Woody Strode is getting some schooling and is trying to recount the Constitution, prompting James Stewart to finish the line. I think it goes like, and all men are created equally. And Strode apologises and says something like, I knew that, I just forgot it, which Jimmy Stewart replies, that's okay, a lot of people forget about that part too. I had a Jimmy Stewart impression yesterday, and That was a bad one because I can't hear him in my ear anymore. So I'm going to refrain from my Jimmy Stewart impressions for the rest of this analysis. But yeah, Jimmy Stewart says something like, it's okay. A lot of people forget about that part, that men are created equally. And I thought it was a great line. But I also thought at the same time, if I had heard that in something like Hidden Figures, for instance, it would be groan inducing. Like I said, one reason is because I feel that line has genuine bite and relevance in 1962, whereas now it would feel carefully crafted and much more redundant. I guess why I feel that kind of thing works better back then and not now is that back then it feels like something to wake up the masses, whereas now it feels like more like a line that a preacher says to the choir. You're preaching to the choir, you know what I mean? So it comes across as insufferable. But hey, maybe that's just me. So the question I'm trying to get into is, when you were looking back at history in these old movies as a spectator from 2009, where these themes and situations doesn't have as much bite in your era, is there enough in a film like Liberty Valance to entertain you? Well, it's a very interesting movie to dissect, actually. And listen, I don't want to give the impression that race is the central concern of this movie. It's a very small part. I just segued into it to make a point, and I did find my reaction to a line that I heard back then, had I heard it now, it would have irked me. And I don't know, that might say something about me. It might say something about the time, I don't know. But I just thought it was interesting to bring up. But anyway, the movie to me is much more about how idealism and social justice works in the real world. And I think two things stop it from being simply a message movie of its time that's steeped in themes that, to be fair, are universal, like communities coming together, the oppressed versus the oppressor, the common man's needs over big businesses, the importance of having and bringing law and civilization to places and curtailing brutality. And the Western genre has always been good for that type of thing. Now, the first thing which I mentioned in passing, which is the most interesting to me, and I'll talk about it in a minute, and that is how idealism works in actuality, which is a philosophical conversation I'll just put on hold for a minute. I just want you to think about it, but I'll delve into it more shortly. But the first thing, well, the second thing, or was it the third thing? I don't know where the fuck I am now, but I want to talk about Jimmy Stewart's character, Ransom Stoddard. It's actually perfect casting. Like I mentioned earlier, Stewart is an everyman, so he is instantly believable as a champion of the people, and you totally buy his character. So when he arrives in the town of Shinbone as a young law clerk, you totally buy into his earnestness and his wide-eyed optimism and his unblinkered, uncompromising belief that law can prevail over brutality and gun violence, and right will triumph over wrong, and that everything can be solved through law and order and decency. Now, normally these characters are fucking annoying in movies and no fun at all, and pretty boring at times because, well, to put it frankly, we have seen many westerns and know how this kind of thing works out. So to follow a character totally oblivious to our inbuilt knowledge of western movies, it can be pretty annoying that they are not as clued in as us. Yeah, try and reason with the big bad outlaw Liberty Valance, see how that works out. But I totally bought Stewart's character. I totally bought him as a young, idealistic, enthusiastic man who isn't as familiar with Western movies as us, who probably came from a sheltered existence back east and is naive enough to think that the world can be fixed that way. Even in a lawless town like Shinbone, he even keeps his beliefs after being beaten up and robbed on his way into town on a stagecoach as well. He is unwavering, initially anyway, and I think When you discuss these issues like idealism and social justice through a character, first and foremost, who is flawed, who is believable, when a character inhibits these philosophies, it seems a lot less contrived and more like you're telling a story in service of the character. And thankfully, Stewart's character and Stewart's ability as an actor fits in perfectly to that. Actually, another thing as well, the violence is pretty impressive as well for an old movie. Normally punch ups and beat downs in these type of moments are cringe by today's standards and either come across as some roly-poly playground shit between two guys on the ground, or something that you could add boom, baff, bish onto, like the 1960s Batman. Normally is something I just have to ignore as something of its time, but I thought there was a real tangible harshness to the violence in this, the few times it does occur, that I was really impressed by. And there was also a sense of stately, accomplished prestige with ease to Ford's directing that made Liberty Valance so easy to watch. The framing, the aesthetics were just beautiful in a very sweeping way without appearing to do very much on the surface at all. He's a very steady hand, and I definitely will be seeking more Ford films out after this. Now, let me just put this out there. I don't like John Wayne at all. And I'm trying to figure out why. Action stars with limited ability get by on cultivating their personality, and that's what you were drawn to. And if they are wise enough, they will cultivate it to its peak. Somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger, or of course the great Clint Eastwood with his gruff and sneery personality. And although Clint Eastwood is a bully, you feel like Clint is only a bully, you know, if he's solving a crime and you don't give him his answers, he might hang you off a building. Nothing wrong with that. Or as long as you kept to yourself and don't cut him off on the motorway, he'll keep to himself. And plus, he's got some pretty good one-liners as well. Wayne, on the other hand, his persona is that of a bully. You know, he's Biff from Back to the Future. That's who the fuck he is. He reminds me of this kind of dickhead in school who would do random bullying. Just random bullying. Or the guy you might see in a local pub in the countryside who is just a complete obnoxious yob. But because he is part of the community for so long, he gets the kind of respect that is given out of fear and out of everyone else being scared themselves of not being obnoxiously singled out to be bullied next. And that false sense of respect encourages him to be even more of a dick. Well, that, I think, is what I think about him anytime I see him on screen. That's the persona he cultivates, really. It's probably what he's like in real life anyway, but I'm speculating massively on that. I don't know. But you know, it kind of works in this because of the contrast between a very emasculated hero and Stewart in this, with an apron wearing Jimmy Stewart at one point. And Stewart really is far from your typical Western hero. In fact, the only thing that makes him one is his sense of righteousness and his ability to stand up to the bad guy. But he's not your typical Western hero by any means. He's traditionally more your nerdy sidekick to Wayne's man's man hero, but it doesn't work out like that at all in this. So the dynamic between Stewart and Wayne largely actually works because of Wayne's persona in this. It helps, and it actually emasculates Stewart further, which even more widens the odds. And it does this other thing as well. It shows the myth of the cowboy of the West in somebody like Wayne, who I guess is a traditional kind of hero of the genre, and it shows the myth of idealism as well. It shows both of these things being played out in something that is considered real, So for something like Idealism, it's taken from the realm of theory, the theory playbook, and it takes the myth of the cowboy from, I guess, the kind of comic book simplicity of the cowboy. And it shows when you strip away the black and white versions of both of these, you get the grey when they're put on the actual playing field and away from the fantasy or the theoretical playbook. So I like that. So getting back to how idealism works in actuality, to discuss this, it's done in two ways. First, in Stuart's dealings with Lee Marvin's Liberty Valance, and Lee Marvin is a good bad guy in this. One of his sidekicks actually is Lee Van Cleef, and he doesn't have much to do in this, but I thought he really stole the show actually anytime the bad guys were on screen. I don't know if that's because I know him from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, which he would eventually get cast in a few years later, but there's something very magnetic about his performance that you're drawn to, even overshadowing Marvin. To me, Marvin actually reminds me of the guy, I forget his name, he was Hellboy and he was in Sons of Anarchy. I can't remember his name, but he looks a bit like him. But I don't know, Lee Van Cleef, he really felt like he knew what to do with his movements, with his eyes, with his very subdued acting. I was very impressed by him. Even the other fucking hitman, or the other cowboy of the bad guy gang, he's just laughing the whole time. I don't know if he's on crack cocaine or something. But yeah, Lee Marvin was good. But my point was, anyway, that through Stuart's dealings with Lee Marvin's Liberty Valance, to begin with, Stuart is against guns and he wants the law to sort this out. See, my problem with idealism, and what Stuart realises eventually, is that it can only really work if it hypothesizes that everybody plays with the same rules. You don't believe in picking up a gun and killing somebody? That's cool, bro. But what do you do when somebody doesn't believe in that and they come at you with a gun? How does your idealism play into that? And it's very interesting seeing Stuart's character slowly wrestle with that, and what he is eventually and ultimately prepared to do in the pursuit of the law and civilization. Many contemporary critics have described the last 20 minutes of this movie as anticlimactic, and I think that's true if you take the movie as a typical story between a showdown between a good guy and a bad guy. But when you look at the movie as the journey of an idealistic young man and just how far he is prepared to go in what he believes to be the moral good, it's actually a very bittersweet movie, and those extra 20 minutes, they're actually vital to this. Sergio Leone has described the movie actually as the movie where Ford discovers pessimism, and it's very true, I thought. So for a large part of this movie, Stuart is our champion for truth, honesty of the press, no guns, no violence. But the discrepancies, as I keep skirting around, and the sheer amount of things he is ultimately prepared to let slide and keep quiet about in his ascendancy and his political aspirations, in order to get a lofty position where he thinks he can perhaps make a change, is actually very pessimistic where the movie eventually ends up. And how, if you listen closely in the opening scenes, John Wayne's character actually ends up a pauper, with his accolades never mentioned by Stuart's character, I guess allowing the branding of his own image off the back of it, either reluctantly or on purpose, by saying nothing. It's all very troubling stuff. And even taking those accolades that should be given to Wayne's character under the myth of the hero of the West, the fact that they were actually carried out in the most unheroic way as well is equally bittersweet. So there was a lot of things to wrestle with in this movie. If you're looking at it as a straightforward Western, perhaps it won't lean into the elements of the genre in a way people will be expecting. But for me, I enjoyed it because they used the setting of an uncivilized place to examine just how far a man will go to enact change. And normally, when we say how far a man will go, we mean a man that will eventually become as bad as the guy he is trying to catch or defeat. But with Stuart, it's much more of an internal battle with his own principles that stays with you the most. And I guess what I liked about The Man Who Shot the Liberty Valance the most, and what separates it from other Western movies. And it's a very good movie that you guys should definitely check out.